All right, I am absolutely delighted today to welcome Rich Prowse from Content Design London. I wanted to invite Rich because last year I read an article he published on Medium called Transforming Content Design, the Role of Cognition and Decision Making. And he was sharing some early ideas he was having about how understanding cognition can really help us improve our practice as content designers. So I asked him if he'd had any further thoughts about this, and here we are today. So Rich is the Director of Practice at Content Design London, the very famous Content Design London. He oversees all aspects of the company's professional practice, helping people and organisations design more humane products and services. Before joining CDL, Rich was the Deputy Director of Service Design at the University of Bath, where he led a cross-functional design development and content team. And Rich advocates for inclusive design, evidence-based decision-making, and best practice. So I'm going to stop sharing and hand over to Rich. Thank you, Rich.
Hey, good morning, everyone. It's good afternoon, actually. Sorry, I'm in morning mode. I literally just woken up and I have a cup of coffee. So yeah, it's lovely to be here, and thank you for the invite. So I'm just going to share my screen now, and hopefully everything will work. Right, I need to share that one. And then I should be able. Can everybody see my screen? Yeah, cool, brilliant. So yeah, so I really wanted to talk to you today about some ongoing thoughts that I have been having around kind of like how we design content for how people think and act. And I want to take you through the kind of journey I'm on, and also kind of share where my thinking is at now. And it'd just be great to obviously get your questions at the very end and begin to think about how we can design better content for the product, services, or websites that we are responsible for, and what that might mean for us as content designers. So, oh, this is where it goes wrong. Ah, there we go. So first of all, it is really, really lovely to meet you. I probably don't need to do too many introductions to who Content Design London is. We helped codify the discipline of content design. That was Sarah Winters back when she was working at GDS. We now work globally with organizations around the world using a user-led insight approach. And we're there really to help them transform their content to positively enhance the user experience. And since we were founded, we've shared our knowledge with about 20,000 professionals. That's through our books, through our training, which we've obviously helped deliver in Australia. So thank you very much for that. Obviously, I had a great introduction, so I won't stay very long on that. But if you do want to connect with me, basically, it's just Rich Prowse either on LinkedIn, Threads, if you use it, or you can email me at rich.prowse@contentdesign.london. So it's kind of a funny starting point to say what is content design. And there are lots of different ways of looking at content design. I like to think about these as lenses onto the work that we do. And those lenses allow us to explore different ideas and to think about problems that we need to solve or opportunities that we can take in different ways. But for me, really, content design is the practice of sense making. Because unlike traditional writing, content design starts by understanding the very specific wants and needs of the people that we are trying to work with. We use data and insights to inform our decisions. And we work in a collaborative way with designers, research, subject matter experts, to name a few. And we're continuously revising that content based upon real world results. But content design is more than just sense making. It's really important to place it in context. And this is something that doesn't always happen when we talk about content design. Content design is ultimately sits at the intersection between behavioral science and design thinking. That's where human-centered design is. That's where our discipline comes from. It has a rich history and tapestry of thinking and doing and work that we stand on the shoulders of giants. But particularly one of the areas which is of interest to me, and because I spent my early youth as a sociologist studying a degree in the University of Leicester, is behavioral science, which is really thinking about the evidence-based insights into traits around human behavior. So it's what's common to all human behavior. Now, we do talk about it a little bit in content design. We talk about how we read, and we talk a little bit about mental models, but we don't go entirely into the bit that sits kind of there, people's brain. How do they think? Why do they do the things that they do? Because if we're really going to solve the challenges and also support those opportunities for the people that we work with, to deliver that content for the products and services we work on, it's important we begin to understand what makes humans humans. Why do they do the things that they do? And there'll probably be plenty of times when you've been looking at analytics, you've been in user research. Sorry, I've just had a text. Where you've like, I didn't expect them to do that. Why are they doing that? And that is always interested me. I've always thought, well, why are they doing that? Why do we see those common patterns from people not making mistakes? Because that's actually one of the conversations that we often mistake, that our users are making mistakes. No, they're doing what we would do because they're humans. And when you need to shift away from the idea that users make mistakes, it's actually incumbent on us to solve those problems. So for me, as a content designer, what I'm doing is really helping to understand the content, helping them to understand the content by considering how they process the information, reason, and make decisions within, specifically in the context of their lived experience, because we are all the sum of our parts. And the context in which we live does influence the way in which we interact with the products and services we use. So ultimately, for me, as content designers, we are sense makers. And what do I mean by that? Well, you kind of hear when we do training at CDL, we talk about kind of like how the internet's changed. And I'm going to just twist that around a bit and kind of put a different lens onto it. So we know the internet changed everything, how we consume content, how we make decisions about content, and the speed at which we can act. And we now have lots of choices. The quality of content varies. Organizations are expecting us to do more and more online with less and less human support. And our role is, if we want these things to work as an effective sense maker, you need to make sure that you understand how people think and act. Because if you don't, then it's a missing piece, a missing part of your toolbox. It's very well to write in plain language. It's really good to obviously structure information, thinking about how repeatable design patterns. But if we don't understand the mechanics, then how do we begin to really understand how to support people in the right way at the right time? So our ability to design products and services depends on our understanding. And this is something that I kind of wanted to talk to you a little bit more. And an incomplete narrative, so an incomplete understanding of people, can mislead or risk harm. And this is something that we don't really talk about as a community as much as we should. We have a responsibility as designers, and I use that word as broad as possible, to think about what we do and how we do it and the potential impact of the choices that we make. But what's really important in that is also to recognize that actually a lot of people who design content, post that information online, aren't designers, they aren't content designers, they aren't content strategists, they aren't UX writers, they aren't trained communications professionals. And that's slightly boring when you begin to look at the kind of more kind of insidious nature of what goes on sometimes with choices that have either been deliberately or unintentionally made. So what got me into this kind of like rabbit hole, and has been a little bit of rabbit hole, so I'm trying very carefully not to take you down the rabbit hole with me too much, was a few years ago. I set myself a goal of reading a book a month. That was one of those New Year's resolutions where you're like, I'm going to read a book a month, and you're like, am I going to read a book a month? I have. I'm really enjoying that. Just top tip, I personally find being in the bar the best space for me, because basically I don't fall asleep, and actually it's quiet, so I am able to read a book. But actually I have dyspraxia, so reading can be quite a lot for me sometimes. So I'm quite proud of that. But there were 3 books that I kind of unintentionally ended up reading, kind of not in this particular order on the screen, but basically reading out of sequence, which was really Thinking Fast and Slow. Some of you may have heard of that book. The Case Against Big Tech and Nudge. And they helped me realize that I may only have part of the narrative. And I kind of knew that, but it kind of shone a light in a way that I hadn't really begun to think about before. And the missing part really was cognition, and also how biases and errors in our thinking can affect how we understand and act. Um, and that was that. Whilst they don't talk about those, they do talk about these topics. They don't talk about content in that way we would recognize it. But every single time they're talking about content in one form or another, how people are interacting with either products or services, or how people are making choices about the information that they are basically engaged with. So, understanding cognition, or the mental process of acquiring information through experience and senses, can obviously make you a better sense maker. But it also means you can design for safety and you can avoid harm, because not only do you recognize when there's potential harm, what you're doing would make you like harm, but you can also see it in other people's work. And as designers, we make choices every day for the people using our products and services. And I think it's really important to put that lens that you have a choice. We often feel that we don't have choices in the things we do, but actually we do have agency here. This is something we do have choice over. And for me, I kind of realized if we only partially understand human behavior, we might be making unintentional choices that could harm them. So, for example, a really simple example of this is the power of defaults, which is making something the first choice means more people are likely to use it. But that might not be the right choice for them. So, for example, in the past, I put like lists into alphabetical order, but actually that might not have actually been the right thing to do, because the default would have been potentially the thing that they would choose first. And that might not have been the right choice for them. And appreciate that then you think, oh, what are we going to do? I'm not saying panic. I'm just saying I think it's important to have a lens onto that and an awareness. And something that brought that home to me was a documentary which was aired in March 2023 on the BBC. I'm going to show you a very, very short clip. I'm hoping you're going to be able to hear the audio. If you can't, nice people at we can you just put your hands up and I'll just explain what it was. Hopefully you'll hear it. Can you hear anything? Okay, hold on. Let me just see if it plays now. Can you hear that?
We're still not getting the sound, Rich.
Okay, right. So basically what this shows is a feature that was, and I don't know if it's still on X now, but what they discovered was that they could reduce the amount of hate speech on Twitter through a simple, basically dialogue that would appear when someone tried to reshare something. So basically the scenario was, I'm on Twitter, I've come across a post which is linked to maybe a web page or an article, and algorithmically detected it might be something that was in an area of contention because based upon what was in the kind of the information that was pulled in. And when somebody actually went to reshare it, it would detect potentially whether they'd engage with the content or not, and actually ask them, have you read this content? So that's words. That is literally words. Have you read this content? And what they discovered was not only would that dialogue reduce the amount of people who were sharing it and the associated hate speech that would come with it, but what was really interesting is those people who had seen that dialogue were less likely themselves in the future to share hate speech. So that simple interruption, that simple dialogue and question had changed not only the initial behavior, but future behaviors of individuals. Now, we're filled with a world that doesn't always make sense. But for me, this one simple, very powerful act of just simply asking, have you read this? Which actually, if you think about it, is very similar to what you do if you're in a room with somebody and they were saying, oh, I read, blah, blah, blah. You'd be like, have you actually read that article? They'd go, probably no, I probably need to go and do it. It just kind of done something very human, but it said it actually had a positive benefit on the whole kind of social community within inside what was then Twitter. And what that told me was we can do positive things. We have agency. If we understand how people think and act, we can make choices for them in a kind of programmatic way, but or a design pattern way, which will help support them in a way to encourage, not like manipulate them, but just ask them, in this particular question, have you actually read this? So what I also thought about was, and this comes back to how the internet has changed everything, is that the impact of our work as sense makers depends on the scale at which our design choices are being consumed. And what I mean, like, let's unpack that. What I mean in the past is like when somebody like filled out a form in the past, they were probably printed, it was probably sent in the post, and somebody filled that out and then they would send it back, and it was all very slow and very human, and there might be human interaction involved. But now a lot of our work is consumed at extremely high pace. It is influences large numbers of people quite quickly. So what we're doing is, in some respects, if you actually step back and look at it, we're in a giant experiment here. We're in a giant experiment. We're doing stuff we don't fully understand what's going on. So again, I'm just putting that lens on there for you to begin to pause and reflect about how we might think about the things that we do as content designers as a whole. So our choices, the choices we make as content designers, have the potential, I'm stressing have the potential, to affect more people than ever, maybe in positive ways or negative ways. And as sense makers, it's incumbent on us to educate others, including other designers and colleagues, about our own work, what that means to be a designer in a space where we can influence large numbers of people. And if you think about it, this isn't just about safety or harm or hate speech. This is about everyday things that we do. Banking, education, and health decisions are all potentially being made online. But are we helping and supporting them? Yes, we're writing in plain language. We are structuring information well. We're structuring those journeys, which is part of obviously designing for how people think and act. But are we actually thinking about the mechanics, how people are processing the information, evaluating it, and making decisions? And all those books that I read highlight how thinking shapes our actions, which is like a really obvious statement. But when you say it, you go, yeah, that's true, doesn't it? And this is critical in all the content we consume and how it's presented and designed. And I just want to give you a little thing that really was the thing that ultimately made me think, I need to talk about this. We need to think about this more as a community and begin to think about how we engage in this space more. There's a study, I've kind of called it Closing the Gap. And it's the title, the beginning of the title of the study. And it's actually nudging when you read about it, but I wanted to share it here because this was the one that really affected me. Because I worked in higher education, and there's a academic called Susan Donusky, and her colleagues discovered by flipping the order in which students received a financial guarantee resulted in more students from low-income families from applying and enrolling in higher education in the United States. So this was a study done at the University of Michigan. They discovered they could increase the number of low-income students attending university. And the way they did this was they identified, very similar to here in the UK, you can identify students from low-income backgrounds or backgrounds where they haven't gone to university or potentially don't have a history of higher education based upon whether they have subsidized meals at school. What was critical was all these families were entitled to financial aid, pretty much remission of fees. They were able to go to university for free in essence. And what happened was simply one group received a marketing pack which said, we will guarantee you financial aid as long as you apply and you're admitted. So they received information in a different order. And the other group received a packet of encouraging them to apply to the university, which was like every other pack that any other student received. And actually what would have happened is once they applied, they would have received that financial guarantee. So the only difference here is they received that guarantee, information of a guarantee in that pack. So the information order was changed, the journey was changed. And what they found was that this reduced uncertainty amongst students around financial aid and led to a significant increase in applications enrollments. But here's the really interesting thing. 68% of students who received a guarantee applied, compared to 26% who didn't. 27% of the students who received a guarantee then went on to enroll, compared to 12% who didn't. And I thought to myself, how many times have I been in a conversation in higher education where this detail hasn't even been thought about very much, and how critical in that decision-making process, the thinking and acting that's happening, is it? So our information, our content is doing things. And when you begin to think about it like that, you're like, wow, with great power does come with great responsibility. And it's probably incumbent on me to understand a little bit more about what's going on here. And we do have an impact on people. And that could be a positive one, a negative one, it could be a neutral one. But I think it's important we all recognize that we have agency. As designers often, content designers often speak about the fact that they don't feel that they're making an impact, or they don't have an influence, not quite sure how to articulate what they do and why it's important. Well, here's a real reason. Here's the real reason why your job is so important. Because we know that the benefits of higher education, some of it's a little bit debated. But if you go to college or university, you're probably going to have better job prospects. You're probably going to earn more money, and you're going to have a better quality of life. So if you join those up, that choice has the potential to improve the life outcomes of someone. And that's what really kind of got me. I was like, all those stupid conversations that I used to have in higher education about, is that on brand or is that not? Were not the point. The point was, is the content going to help the person basically complete the task and be successful? But more than that, what is the net effect of our activity here? And actually, when you think about it, that's tied to marketing as well. And it's tied to goals around, widening participation, particularly here in the UK. I've seen you have very similar in Australia. That simple act didn't require a huge amount of money, didn't require really any massive change to what they were doing, but it actually changed something significant for those people. So to summarize, what I'm really saying is, by understanding that narrative, by understanding people as deeply as possibly as you can, and I appreciate there are limits to that. I'm not saying spend 6 months in an ethnographic study, but understanding that them as deeply as possible, you can design for a way that supports them and their well-being. And it's about using our knowledge of design and human cognition to tackle real-world challenges that benefit people. But also, I want to just talk about, it does have an impact in your organization. And sense making benefits people and organizations. So a study by McKinsey, a consultancy, you can obviously go, I'm not quite sure about the value of consultancies, but McKinsey did a design-led study. They looked at businesses who were effectively design-led, and they found that organizations that invested in design outperformed their peers in terms of shareholder returns, but also customers were happier and more satisfied. Now, there are so many different experiences we could talk about where we know, as somebody who's consumed a product or service from a design-led organization, where you think, oh, that's quite nice. The most tangible ones that you could immediately think about are like Apple. Their content, the way they design everything, even down to the box itself, how it lifts off, has been designed, and you feel good about it. That's why people retain these boxes. I mean, I had to throw a load away. I was like, why am I keeping these boxes? It's like, but it's the box. But Disney, and you don't think of Disney as design-led. They just use the word Imagineering. But they are design-led, in the parks at least, design-led. And if you've ever been to Disney World in Florida, or Disneyland in California, or Disneyland in Tokyo, you will know what it means to go into that designed experience. You are immersed, and everything, reality is suspended. But how that joins up as a customer experience, how that content all works, from the website through to when you arrive at the hotel, everything is seamless. And again, you feel really positive and good about it. So, even though they're my experiences, but I bet you can think about your own, where you think, actually, that was a really good experience and that was well thought through. Because that's what we do. We make sense of the information. We help to sequence that information in a journey. We help to make sure that journey makes sense. And this is just that next step. How do we make sure that we support that in a way that's beneficial? So when your boss asks you what value you bring, and this is a constant topic for designers and content designers in particular, because content is often seen as not very valuable. And I think I've talked today about why it is really valuable. You're a sense maker. You are a change maker in your organization. You are there to start understanding people's wants and needs. you're using data to inform decisions. You're working closely, so you're collaborating to make sense of the unfamiliar or complex so people can successfully interact with the product or service provided by the organization you're working for. Because let's be honest, if the content, if I was to open up a government website, GDS, let's say gov.uk tomorrow, and there was no content in it, it wouldn't do anything. Fundamentally wouldn't do anything. It couldn't operate. You have a really valuable role. And this is what sets you apart from a traditional writer, but more so when we begin to think about how people think and act. So how do we design for people? Well, unsurprisingly, it starts with people's wants and needs. And I actually want to just spend a little bit of time just here. Because people are like, what's the difference between wants and needs? And I read recently a really lovely piece. It's in a Harvard D School book, but it kind of summed up in such a beautiful way. And I was like, that makes perfect sense. I finally, like, even me, I'm like, why couldn't somebody just say that to me earlier? So wants are simply what people express. They are the conscious things they're saying. It's like, needs are unconscious. They're not necessarily expressed, but they are there. And what I mean by that is that those famous quotes from like Henry Ford or Apple, Steve Jobs, where he says, effectively, if I asked people what they wanted, they just said they wanted a faster horse, but the need was actually they wanted to get somewhere quicker. There's the difference. Or if I asked people what they wanted in a phone, they wanted a better keyboard. No, what they wanted was some better way to interact with their device. There's the difference, and that's the kind of simplest I can say. That's how to think about it. Wants are really conscious, expressed thoughts. Needs, less so. They may just be something that they aren't even aware of, or it might be an underlying aspect of a want. So we start with people's needs. We organize the journey based upon the information we have, the data, and then we choose design patterns and formats that consider cognition, motivation, and cognitive load for people to successfully complete tasks. So what do I mean by motivation? Because motivation, it's one of these awkward words that's being used that I find difficult. I'm like, motivation? But motivation really determines the amount of effort we put into something, whether we're likely to stay focused on the task, and if we will keep trying even when things get difficult. And our job is to make sure people do not become overwhelmed and can process information efficiently. So there are 5 areas of cognitive demand, and I've only got limited time, so I've had to kind of package this up. So there is more information. I'd strongly encourage you to look at people like Microsoft's Inclusive Design for Cognition guidebook. Basically, there's learn, focus, which are kind of self-explanatory. I need to learn something. I need to focus on the task at hand. I need to make a decision. I need to recall. So I need to remember what I've learned or been told, and I need to understand communication. That actually is probably a little bit of a misnomer. It's basically I need to be able to understand in a way that makes sense to me. And interestingly, when we use these 5 lenses to think about what we're trying to achieve with that content, it begins to reframe that conversation as well. Because actually, we don't tend to have that conversation often. It's like, what? We often say, okay, well, this is a blog post. Who's the audience? What do we want to achieve? But actually, maybe there's another layer here. Are we asking someone to learn something? Are we wanting to recall it, to share it with someone else? What are we trying to get them to do here? It might be multiple things. There is one fundamental principle in all of this, that motivation must equal or surpass a user's cognitive load for them to complete a task. So here's a really good instance of where that sometimes occurs and sometimes doesn't. And you probably will all have an experience of it. So the scenario is you have to find a template, for example, just to help you kind of like create a structure around what you're doing. And there have been so many times where I've like, I just need a template to like work out how to structure this, or like, what do all these different templates do? Like, like for a brief or something. And you go to the internet to download something free because obviously you don't want to buy it. And then you end up at a website and you're like, they're asking for my email. It's like, well, this feels a lot. And then you get past the email bit, and then they said they go, oh, you can download it. You're like, but where's the download button? It's like there are 3 download buttons. There's one that looks a little bit like an advert. There's one that could be the download button. And then you give up. You're like, I've already shared my information. I already feel like I've had 5 pop-ups, and now I can't even find the download button. And there has been so many times where I've just given up. But there have been occasions where I really needed that information, where my motivation was very high, where I basically persevered and eventually found that download button. That's the simplest example I can give you in terms of relating to maybe your own experience. So what could you do to support these 5 areas of cognitive function? Well, on a learning side, no surprises, clear instructions broken into steps using plain language, make it easy to learn. Progressive disclosure, introduce information gradually to avoid overwhelming people. Use consistent design patterns to reduce the learning curve. So in essence, just making sure that they don't have to relearn your content or your website every time. Focusing, breaking information in small chunking up information, you're familiar with that. Use the information pyramid, so hierarchy of information. Don't bury the lead. It has lots of different words that people use. Remove unnecessary elements to reduce distractions. Making decisions. Limit decision. Not how many times have you ever come to a page where like, oh, there's a lot of decisions. What am I going to do? And provide sensible options that positively benefit people. Also give immediate feedback on an action, so people know that something has happened as a result of doing that thing. Recalling information, consistent language. So, the importance of a style guide, consistently calling something the same thing. There have been so many times where, like, when I was looking at higher education, I was like, is that the same thing? Or is that just like something different? And everybody's like, I don't know. And it's like, well, if we don't know, how are our users going to know? Visual cues, icons, color to help people remember and process information more quickly, and ways to filter information. So that could just be as simple as a robust navigation and a consistent navigation, or different ways into information. And finally, communicating, using plain language, avoiding jargon and technical terms. No surprise there. Providing the right format in the right way at the right time. Not writing is not always the answer. A video might be more useful or more effective, and making sure that your content is accessible and inclusive. Those are some of the stuff that kind of relate directly to kind of more the kind of general principles of content design, but they're aligned under those lenses. But, and here's the but, we need to remember that basically there are biases and errors in human decision making. We like to think that humans are logical. They make rational decisions and they do things that make sense. If you think about your own behavior, how many times have you not done something that's rational or made any sense to anybody else, and or you've reflected after and gone, I have no idea why I did that. And basically, what you need to know is there are 2 types of thinking. So this comes from Thinking Fast and Slow, and I'm really like cutting down a huge book into like a small bite-sized chunk. So what you need to know is there are 2 types of thinking: System 1 and System 2 thinking. System 1 is fast, intuitive, emotional, and influences like with our feelings, our gut, our lived experiences. System 2 is slower and requires logical effort and is conscious. Now, weirdly enough, some of that depends upon who you are, your lived experience. So like if you ask a mathematician, like, to multiply 344 by 72, they'd be like, and they would be using System 1. If you ask me, I will be like, and I'll be like, sister, I'd be on System 1 thinking. So that's the first thing you know. It's very dependent on the individual. But generally, as a rule, we prefer System 1. We like to we need to like process information. And that's where mental models come in. We help to kind of take shortcuts, do things quickly, because our brain doesn't like to use System 2. It requires a lot of effort. We have to be conscious about it. And if you've ever thought about a problem, you've had to really, really think it. It's quite a lot of basically cognition. A lot of energy needs to be used. Now, what's important for you to understand is that it's the interaction between these 2 systems that can lead to biases and errors in our decision making. And when that occurs, that's when people make weird choices or don't do things that you would expect or make bad choices. So there are some ways, and they touch on it in Nudge, about how you can begin to overcome biases. So one of them, and again, this really relates to the things we were talking about before, sludge. That's their word for basic. You know, when you come to a page and you literally want to lose the will to live, it's like legal terms. Get rid of sludge. Salience, which is really about how important that information is presented to the user. So if there's something you want them to do, make sure it is salient to them. However, they also talk about the importance of slowing decision making. We're always talking about people making fast decisions. Interestingly, and quite correctly, there may be times where actually you want someone to think this through, force them into type 2 thinking. So that's about really removing sludge, is about basically removing obstructions to understanding. Salience is about pulling out the best option by making it clearer. And then obviously slowing decision making is really what it says on the tin. Encouraging people to think before they act. But that, if you think about it, is a design pattern. We don't always talk about things in that way, about how we can use those different design patterns to achieve different outcomes for our users and successful outcomes. So earlier I talked about the power of defaults, and I said defaults can be a good thing, but they also can be a bad thing. So for an example, there was an example in Nudge where basically choosing a pension product, they put a particular pension product, if memory serves me correctly, at the very top, but this was not the best option for people. It was actually slightly further down. And what happened was everybody chose the wrong pension option, the one that was not good for them, because the power of default, the power of salience was that people just went, and they chose that. So why is this important? So within Microsoft's inclusion design for cognitive inclusion, there is talk about how you can begin to design for cognition. But my first port of call would always be, regardless of that, always research and test as you go. Make sure that you're achieving the outcome that you want to achieve. And what I mean by that as well is, I'm not expecting, I appreciate some people as teams of one, some people work in very small teams, some people don't even have user researchers, or only able to do very discrete pieces of user research. But testing and research is really important, and scale it to what you can achieve. If you work in large scale systems, then you should be doing this, because the impact of those decisions is greater and potentially either positive or could be really harmful. So finally, as I said, with great power comes great responsibility. I love that line. It's overused. It's totally overused, but it's a good line. As sense makers who have knowledge of human behavior, it is critical we consider how we practice. Our ethics and conduct is something we need to think about. And this is, again, something we don't talk about as designers as much as we should do. We have, other design professions, design-led professions, engineers as well, they have ethics and professional conduct. And it's something very important, because actually, engineers are designing products which potentially are harmful, like cars or airplanes. There's ethics and professional conduct. Architects, they're designers too. You are a designer. Don't forget that. Your medium is different. And that's one of the reasons why we talk about at CDL practitioners, because we're all practicing content designers. And we also call ourselves a practice, not an agency, because ethics and professional conduct, how we do stuff, is really important to us, because we realize the power we have to do good or do bad in the world. So our action should always prioritize the well-being of people, society, and the environment, and your team, actually. Because if we don't, the risks are too great. And if I just kind of pause for a second, we only need to look at social media companies who made decisions quite fast, who are now being held to account for the products and services they designed, which may have potentially harmed users. So finally, before I kind of finish, users or people, it's a great debate. I prefer to use the word people. And I focus on their wants, leads, and lived experience instead of users. And the reason I do that is I think users dehumanizes it. And when you use certain types of language, you begin to frame your conversations in very particular ways. Users feels to be passive; they're consuming things. Why is it important we think about them? When you think about people and humans, you think, actually, no, I really need to think about what I'm doing here. And I choose human-centered over user-centered because people aren't just interacting with a neutral interface and neutral content. We're interacting with a design that reflects the dominant values and belief of the people who made it, and critically, the biases of its creators. So these ideas are not new. I'm not presenting anything new. Disciplines like anthropology, sociology, who use similar ethnographic methods as designers do, that's basically long-term study of people or participants, surveys, I'm reading a book at the moment, I have Think Like an Anthropologist, and it charts the history of anthropology from 1900 through to modern day. And actually, there's debates about how anthropology was framed in the 1900s and even earlier, and how that led to behaviors for justification of colonialism and things like that. The words we use are so important. It's not just how we talk to people and how we read information, it's then how we frame the world that we see around us. So a good example in human-centered design is accessibility. And when we talk about accessibility, we actually, if you think about it, the dominant culture, accessible people who do not have disabilities, through action, not deliberate, potentially disabling people's access to products and services, because we're not thinking fully about the people, their lived experience who are using our products and services, because we're seeing it through a very specific lens of that dominant culture. So when we design, I'd always say to you, be accurate and honest. And I think everybody in this room will try to strive to do that. Consider cultural and situational context for that person. Design for safety. So design, not design, think actually could, this is a big decision. I'm working on a pension product, or I'm working in health. We need to make sure that people end up doing the right thing as a result of this. Ensure accessibility. That's a no-brainer. Every product and service you should design should be accessible. Protect privacy and security. Of course, you want to protect people's privacy and security. That might be different things in different ways, and fundamentally prevent manipulation. So these things, if you put together in the right way, you could manipulate people into doing things they don't want to do without them realizing. So like I said, with great power comes great responsibility. Thank you. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Rich. That was amazing. I love how you very modestly said you're not saying anything new, but I think what you did was bring things together in a really new way. And I know that I'll be thinking about that in some of the work I'm doing at the moment. And especially the way you talked about those lenses and put those content design approaches we might use under those lenses. I think I'm going to find that super, super helpful when we're trying to prioritize which things we concentrate on. I'd like to open up to questions. Rich does have a hard stop at the top of the hour because he's about to start his proper working day. So please pop up your hand or pop something in the chat if you'd like to ask a question. I have questions if other people don't, but I know that I'd like to give the community a chance to talk to Rich.
I think I've got one question in chat actually,
Yes.
which is about do you have any advice to how to ensure accessibility? Many content designers don't do this. Wow, that is a big question. So I'm going to answer this in two ways. I think there's a lot of responsibility that's placed on content designers to fix accessibility issues. And I think we have a responsibility to design where we can accessibly. However, that also requires the support of designers and developers. And what I sometimes see is they don't necessarily understand why you want to do something in a particular way. So I think there's an education piece that needs to be done. But I also think sometimes as a community, we tackle the problem in the wrong way. I've seen so many conversations fail with senior leadership when you're talking about the accessibility of the page. And for them, they're not thinking like that. Leaders and decision makers do not think about. They're like, oh, this is a page, but how is that? Yes, it's not exactly where it needs to be, but how is that going to affect the business? So I think we need to reframe those conversations. If we're a senior content designer, we need to think about how those people think. So they think in risk, they think in impact, and they think in like how to mitigation. That's the things that they think about. They're the language they use. So just before I left Bath, one of the things that we were doing was thinking about how do we meet the new government legislation around public sector accessibility duty. Now, fortunately, Bath's website, actually the front end, like the public, the end you see is actually very, very accessible thanks to the designers and developers who spent a lot of time making sure that that was the case. The rest of the university systems are less accessible, and that's probably the most experience of us all, that most organizations spend time making sure that their external website is accessible, but actually there are real challenges in most organizations around the kind of accessibility of other systems, and I was very, very keen that that be something they thought about. So instead of talking about like we need to meet WCAG guidelines, we need to meet this, the first thing is education. So the first thing we did was an accessibility audit, and actually we built a tool, very simple tool, which basically asks people who owned these systems, because it's very dispersed, to like answer a series of questions like when was it built, did they even think about accessibility, and then gave it a risk score. So that then what we were able to do is begin to have a conversation with them about these are the riskiest points in the university and these are the reasons why. So what mitigation are we going to take? So does that require us to think about a replacement? Does that require us to take alternative steps? But that shifts the conversation around the page level conversation, which is important when you're interacting maybe with stakeholders, to more kind of strategic conversations about these are the risks to the organization if we don't do this, and these are the areas of risk. And that is a more strategic thinking about accessibility. And I'd strongly encourage you, if you're at that level, to begin to think like that. Like anytime anybody says WCAG, you senior leaders, you can see them like, blah, blah, blah. And you shouldn't expect them to know that, because they're making lots of decisions every day, but that's just another thing in the head. You need to work with them and help them understand why this is important. And there might be different techniques you use, but the first step is getting that out into the open and showing them the extent of the problem and what that might mean as they manage it carefully, because they can't replace everything immediately. But what they can do is begin to understand the scope of the problem, what's needed to be done from a kind of financial and business perspective. So that's the kind of senior leader. On the stakeholder level, I'd say education, working with stakeholders, getting them involved in user research, getting them to see what that really means for them fundamentally. And content designers who are not doing it, if you can't, I completely understand. I've worked in systems which are like, you don't have alt text. It's like, great, I can't put alt text in. But if you can, then you should, because it's really important. There are so many times where I've seen in my career when I was working in education, students being held back by the fact that they couldn't access transcripts for videos, or they couldn't understand the content because it wasn't ordered in the right way. So one of the things that happened in the pandemic was neurodiverse students were really struggling, because what was happening was information was being delivered out of sequence. So it was really difficult for them to like construct that information back into a way that made sense for them. So a simple change of thinking, actually, we need to kind of think about how this is being delivered as a curriculum. Just that simple change and making sure it's sequenced correctly would have changed a lot. So a lot of this thing is really simple, just like accessibility, writing clearly, sequencing information in a sensible way. I appreciate transcripts were a little harder back then, but there is now AI. It's not perfect, but enabling that would just be even a simple step forward. I hope that answers the question.
We do have another couple. Rich, I might let you
Yeah.
choose which one.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
I love the one about ethical nudges, actually, because when we know we have this power and we want to use it responsibly, how do we make sure other people do too?
Yeah, I think that's the one thing that worried me actually when I read all of that. Was like, I was thinking, how many people that I work with have no knowledge of this and are actually, I think the bigger problem is unintentionally making choices that are harmful. And it's a really strong word to use, harmful, but when you think about the end extent of all those choices, what happens? I think that is a question. I don't think I actually have an answer for that, because I think this is such a new area, at least to me, and also actually to the content design community. I think the first starting point for me is always, understanding the context of the degree of risk. So like if you're working with a really vulnerable group of people, or the decision that's going to be made will have a big impact on their future wealth, health, or prospect, their education, I think you need to think that's a bigger risk point, and we really need to spend some time doing some proper research around this to understand what's happening, to make sure that people are making the right decisions, because this comes down to time and resource, doesn't it? Ultimately, the reality is that all of us in this space probably always want to make the right decision, but the pressure on us is time and availability of resource in a project. So unfortunately, I think there's a bit around learning more about how to create safe design patterns, which we can then share. There's a bit about us testing those big choices that we're asking people to make sure that they're evaluating as much as they can as humans, as I've just described. They don't make rational decisions all the time. And then also monitoring that through testing and data. There's one on AI. I'll try and answer that one very, very quickly. Everybody always asks CDR about AI. I think that's a really complicated area. So there's a lot of hype going on about AI, and that AI will take over our world and will, destroy jobs. It will, but I don't think it's going to do that immediately. I think from an AI perspective, I've used the tools. I think if you're using AI, you need to be really open that you've used it. I don't think we should see it as the big bad wolf in the room either, because actually, I've used it a few times just to have a conversation. I'm like, I've got a few ideas. I just need like someone else to speak to. And in the past, because we're actually remote, entirely CDL, I'd have just turned to a colleague and probably annoyed them for about 15 minutes, being like, I just need to think about this. Can I just have a chat with you? And I don't have that luxury. I can't just go and interrupt a colleague who's maybe on a project, or they don't sit next door to me. So sometimes I'm just like, I have this idea. Can you like had a riff off it? And some of the times I'm like, or can you just rephrase this in a way that I could better like make it clearer? Because actually that's what you'd have done with a colleague. So I think ultimately it's a tool for creativity and stimulating thought. It's not necessarily a tool to write content. It's not, if you've ever actually got it to write content, it does it well some of the time, but it's not particularly reliable. And it depends on the area. And actually, we used it for a little bit of data analysis, and I actually called it out what it calls hallucinating. So it like starts making things up, and I'm like, that data isn't even in there. I know it's not in there because I literally know what's in the spreadsheet. And I'm like, is that data in the spreadsheet? It was like, yes, it is. And I'm like, are you sure? And it was like, yes, it is. And I'm like, no, it's not. So I'd say it's an emergent tool. Use it wisely. It's a great tool for stimulating thought, thinking about things in different ways, but it's not a replacement for humans or writing or structuring information. I hope that answers the question as far as I can, because there are so many issues around AI. Like the other day, I read that basically they're running out of materials to train it. And then actually eventually the models might collapse in on themselves. So it actually starts just generating gibberish. And there's some stuff around like when you show it the same image again and again, it begins like it can't draw the thing anymore. So yeah, I hope that helped.
I think we could apply the with great power comes great responsibility to AI as well, Rich, just to your theme of the day. I am going to let you go because I know it's, as I said, the start of your working day in the UK, but I do want to thank you so much again for taking time out of your day to share your thinking with us, your thinking about thinking, which I think lots of us will go away and apply to our practice, as you said. So thank you to Rich. I am going to make some space for announcements if people want to stick around for another couple minutes.
Cool.
But yeah, I'll let Rich depart if he needs to. Thank you.
I'm going to have to go, but it's been lovely meeting you, and thank you for your generosity turning up wherever you are, because I know some places it's late, some places it's early. Thank you so much. It's just it's really overwhelming. Thank you so much.
It's such a lovely community. And I've just seen someone ask how they can stay in touch. It is through the meetup page that we run through Meetup. So please stay in touch through that. I am going to share screen again. So if you do have any announcements that you'd like us to share with this wonderful group, please let us know through chat or by popping up a real hand or a virtual hand. I'll run through ours while you think if you've got anything you'd like to share. Our next meetup is on Thursday, the 29th of August at midday Australian time, because we've got an Australian speaker who's Matt Fenwick, who's one of our friends who is based in Canberra, does a lot of content design work, and is talking about some work he did with the Canberra government, story branding in government. So we'd love to see you there. And then the next month, we are actually talking about AI and how government can work with AI. We've got a specialist AI person coming in from the Queensland government to talk about how they're using and preparing for AI in content and more generally. A reminder that some of our past talks are now up on YouTube, so you can access them. You can just search We Are Content SD on YouTube and they'll come up. We do ask our speakers permission, so they're not all there. And as Rich said, we are Content Design London's partners in Australia for training. So we have a couple courses coming up in September and November. You can access them through the Content Design London website or through our website, weaveweb.com.au/training. So did anyone have anything they wanted to share? Any jobs that people have, any events? We usually have Swapnil from Write the Docs here. He often reminds people to come along to that, especially if you've got a background in technical writing. They talk a lot about content and technical writing together. As to accessing the recording later, Rich will review it and make sure he's happy for us to post it, and it will be, if he's happy, on the YouTube channel. Were there any other questions like that? I think not. So yes, if you do want to, if you joined up the group for this, you will get notified of our next events for that person asking about that. But otherwise, for those of us in Australia, I'll let you end your day. For those of you in the UK, I'll let you start your day. For those of you in the many other parts of the world, I don't know what time it is, but enjoy wherever you are. And thank you again for coming along. Thanks, everyone. I might press end on the meeting. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Dot. Thanks, Alana.